Hola, hoy vamos a hablar de los verbos con cambio de raíz. Hello, today we're going to be talking about stem changing verbs. The first thing you should write down in your notebook is the objective for this lesson. The first objective is you will be able to define and identify the stem of a verb. It's very important to be able to conjugate these verbs correctly, which is our second objective. You will be able to conjugate these stem changing verbs in the present tense. Once you have copied down the objectives, take a second to create a vocabulary list in your notebook. Now, the way you should organize your vocabulary list is just as I have it here, which is organized by 4 categories, the 4 categories of stem changing verbs. The first category is U to UE, and in a few minutes we'll discuss what that is referring to. The verb that has a U to UE stem change is jugar, which means to play, as in a sport or an activity or a game. The second type of stem change verb is O to UE. And the verbs in this category that we'll be studying are poder, to be able to, almorzar, to eat lunch, dormir, to sleep, and then comenzar and empezar, which mean the same thing, to begin. The next category of stem changing verbs is E to IE. The first verb is tener, which we all may be familiar with. It means to have. And it has a little asterisk next to it because it has another kind of spelling change in the yo form. You may remember what that one is. The second verb is querer, to want, pensar, to think, and preferir, to prefer. And the final category of stem change verbs is E to I. The first verb, decir, or to say, also has a spelling change in the yo form, just like tener. And those 2 spelling changes are go verbs. The yo forms end in go. And the last verb that we'll look at is repetir, which means to repeat. So make sure you take a second to copy these into your notes. So, once you have your vocabulary list, the next 2 terms you should add beneath them. There are 2 terms that are going to help us understand how to conjugate these verbs. So, the stem of a verb is also known as the root of the verb. And essentially, it's the part of the infinitive, if you remember what an infinitive is. It's the part of the infinitive without the AR, ER, or IR. So if we look at an example of a verb, the verb querer, if we were to cut off the ER of this verb, what's left is the stem, which is written in blue. Now, stem changes are simply a spelling change that happens in the stem. So we conjugate the end of the verb, and we have, with some verbs, stem changes or spelling changes in the stem. Now, stem changes are important not just because of spelling, but also how we pronounce the words. So these stem changes affect our pronunciation. There are 2 more terms that we need to have in our notes before we can begin looking at how to conjugate these verbs. In this slide here, we're going to look at our first objective. What is a stem and how do we identify it? So a definition of a stem is the part of the infinitive, or the unconjugated verb, without the AR, ER, or IR. So if we look at an example, the verb querer, which means to want, if we were to take the ER off of this verb, what we'd be left with is called the stem. The stem is also known as the root of the verb. The spelling changes that occur in the stem, in this blue part, are called stem changes. And essentially, it's a spelling change that happens only in the stem of the verb. And the spelling change happens in the vowels in the stem, to be more specific. So we will never change consonants like Q and R here to anything different. And if we have two vowels, like the verb querer does in a stem, we will always be changing the vowel closest to the end. So I'll say that again. We will never change consonants. Those will never have a stem change. And if there are two vowels, then it's the last vowel, or the one closest to the end, that will have the stem change. Now, stem changes are important not just for spelling, but also for pronunciation. If we're adding letters to a word, we're changing its pronunciation. So once you have these terms written down in your notebook, the next thing I'd like for you to do is copy down 4 big verb charts. We're going to be filling them in and also diagramming a little bit on them. The first verb that we'll look at is the verb jugar, which means to play. And this verb has a U to UE stem change. Now, what do you notice when you look at this verb chart that's filled out? If you noticed that the nosotros and vosotros forms do not have that stem change, then you identified the correct conjugations that do have a stem change. So the only conjugations of a verb that have a stem change are the yo, the tú, the él, ella, usted, and ellos, ellas, ustedes. Now, many of you who have previously studied Spanish may know a term that we sometimes use to refer to stem change verbs, and it comes from the shape that we would draw around the conjugations on the verb chart that have a stem change. I'm not much of an artist, but you may recognize this shape as something similar to a boot or a shoe. So oftentimes you'll hear these verbs referred to as boot verbs. It's kind of a helpful way to remember which conjugations have a stem change. So if you're ever stuck and you can't remember which conjugation has a stem change, just think of the ones that are inside the boot. The next verb we're going to look at is dormir, which is an O to UE stem change. Again, the same type of spelling change happens, except this time an O instead of a U is turning into UE. But the same idea applies here. Nosotros and vosotros do not have a stem change. That boot, or the verb conjugations within the boot, are the only ones that have the stem change. Another thing I'd like to point out, we're talking a lot about stem changes, and we haven't talked about the ends of these verbs, these conjugations here. If you'll notice, dormir is an IR verb, and its endings, o, es, e, imos, is, en, are the same as all the regular verbs that we've studied so far. So the only thing we're doing differently is we're paying more attention to this vowel in the stem and making sure we know how to properly spell its stem. So other verbs from our vocabulary list that have the same spelling change are poder, almorzar, comenzar, and empezar. The next verb we'll look at is the verb querer, which is an important verb because it helps us talk about things that we want. Querer means to want. This verb is an E to IE stem changing verb. And if we look at the conjugations on this verb chart, we notice that the U is still in the stem. Remember when we talked about in our opening notes, if there are two vowels in a stem, the last vowel in the stem will have the stem change, okay? So it's so important to be able to identify the stem of a verb, because then you're going to be able to identify which vowel has the spelling change, and then you'll be able to spell it correctly. So this verb, when it has its spelling change, has a slightly different pronunciation. See if you can notice the difference in pronunciation between the yo form and the nosotros form. Here we go. Quiero, queremos. Quiero, queremos. You notice we have to pronounce that I now that it's in there. Otherwise, it would sound like quiero, and that doesn't sound correct. Other verbs like querer that have a similar spelling change in the stem are tener, pensar, y preferir. Now, let's see if in your notes you can put a circle around which vowel in the stem of preferir has a stem change. Which vowel in the stem of preferir has a stem change? If you circled this E right here, you are correct. Remember, once we identify the stem of a verb, we can identify the vowel that has the stem change. It's always the last one. Next verb we're going to look at is the verb decir, our final verb here. This verb is an E to I stem change. The E will change to I in these 4 conjugations. Now, decir is also a funny verb in terms of its spelling, because like tener, it has this G that just appears in its yo form. It's one of our other spelling changes that happen in the present tense. So please make note of all of these verbs on your verb charts and use them as a reference when conjugating and working through our assignments in class. We're now going to move on to some práctica. At this point, you should pause the video, fill in these sentences in your notebook, and in a few seconds, we are going to go through the answers. Good luck. All right, hopefully you feel confident about your ability to conjugate these. Let's take a look at the answers here. So when I look at these sentences, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm paying attention to the verb in parentheses, and I'm already starting to think about what stem change does this verb have. The other thing I'm thinking about is, what's the subject of the sentence? That subject is going to tell me how to spell this verb. Remember, the subjects inside the boot have a stem change. So let's do this first one together. Yo juego el rugby los fines de semana. I notice that yo is inside the boot. It is one of our subjects with a stem change. So therefore, I need to put my UE stem change in. Our second sentence, mis amigos, or ellos, which is one of our subjects inside the boot, will have a stem change. Mis amigos juegan el fútbol los fines de semana. Number 3, mis amigos y yo, or nosotros. Hopefully you picked up on that. Nosotros is not inside the boot. So therefore, our verb querer will not have a stem change, and its conjugation will look like this. Queremos. Number 4, ¿a qué hora almorzar tú? Tú is one of our subjects inside the boot, so therefore almorzar will have a stem change. Its conjugation, almuerzas. And our final verb, decir. ¿Qué decir el profesor? El profesor, or el, one of our subjects inside the boot. This means that decir will have a stem change. That E changes to an I. ¿Qué dice el profesor? I hope you did well on this practice activity. Please write down any questions that you have at this point. or make sure that you have written down these sentences if you did not get them correct. And be sure to ask them in class tomorrow. Buena suerte.